Hi, I'm Connie from the Youth Services Room of the Scarborough Public Library, and we've been reading Andrew Clements' book, No Talking, published by Simon and Schuster. And we are ready to finish the book today. I hope you've been enjoying it. The principal in this section is really going to lose it. The boys and girls have been having a contest for 48 hours to see which group can talk the least. Chapter 18, Adventures in the Red Zone. Mrs. Hyatt got back to her school at 11:59. There were several messages on her desk, and Mrs. Overby had taped a note on her chair that read, "Please come to see me in the teacher's room." But the principal was in a hurry. She needed to be on time for 5th grade lunch. 5 minutes later, for the second day in a row, Mrs. Hyatt found herself standing in the middle of a silent cafeteria holding a big red plastic bullhorn. But today it was different. She looked around the quiet room, and the sight of all those 5th graders deliberately disobeying her, well, it nudged her right over the edge. It pushed her right into the red zone. She gritted her teeth, and an angry haze filled her mind, and she knew she was angry, and she knew it wasn't good to be angry, but she was. And she knew that it wouldn't help her, but she had to talk to these kids right now. She could have whispered and every 5th grader would have heard her, but she didn't whisper. She pulled the trigger on her bullhorn. "Have you forgotten our assembly this morning?" The principal's voice was so loud it echoed off the walls. The kids stared at her. She aimed the bullhorn at Dave and yelled, "David Packer, answer me. Do you remember what I told all of you this morning?" When Dave nodded his head, she yelled, "Answer me with your voice out loud." So Dave swallowed his first bite of macaroni and cheese and said, "I remember." His voice sounded very small. Dave felt like he was the scarecrow talking to the great and powerful Oz. Mrs. Hyatt took 5 steps closer to Dave and shouted, "Then why aren't you talking with your friends?" There's a picture of Dave. David had never seen Mrs. Hyatt this mad before, and no one had ever yelled at him with a bullhorn. It seemed unfair to be yelled at with that giant voice, so he decided he wasn't going to be afraid or angry, no matter what. Dave shrugged and said, "Nothing to say," which was perfectly true. Before Mrs. Hunt had started yelling, he had been very happy to just sit and eat and think. "Stand up!" Dave stood up. Every kid in the room was watching him, and so was Mrs. Marlowe, and the custodian and the cafeteria workers. Mrs. Hyatt said, "Talk! I want you to talk right now. I want to hear you tell Todd everything you learned in all your classes this morning. Start talking to Todd now." Dave wasn't an angry sort of kid, not usually. In fact, there was only one thing that nudged him over the edge, and that was being bullied. The only time he had ever gotten into a fight at school was back in 2nd grade when a 5th grader had started picking on him. That's when Dave had learned that you can't just go along with a bully, because then you get bullied more and more. And that's how Dave felt right now. He was getting mad. It felt like Mrs. Hyatt was being a bully with a bullhorn. Again, the principal yelled, "Talk!" And that did it. It was Dave's turn for a trip to the red zone. He glared at Mrs. Hyatt and he shouted, "I do not have to talk now if I don't want to. This is our lunchtime. None of us have to talk." And a sentence flashed into Dave's mind, something he had heard dozens of times on TV shows. This sentence was usually being said to criminals wearing handcuffs, but that didn't seem to matter at the moment. Dave looked around the cafeteria at his classmates and he shouted, "You have the right to remain silent." And with that, Dave pressed his lips together, folded his arms across his chest, and sat down. Lindsay was the first to pick up on Dave's body language. She looked at Mrs. Hyatt and slowly folded her arms. All the girls at the lunch table did the same. And the gesture spread throughout the room like ripples on a pond. Every kid stared at the principal, arms folded and stone silent. Mrs. Hyatt looked around slowly, drew herself up to her full height, and then walked briskly out of the room. She walked down the hall to the school office. She nodded at Mrs. Chaplin, the school secretary, and said, "Hold my calls." Then she went into her own office and closed the door. Back in the cafeteria, it was dead calm. Every kid sat motionless, arms still folded, not sure what to do next. Todd started it. He unfolded his arms and nodded at Dave, and then he clapped his hands. In 3 seconds, every fifth grade boy was clapping like mad. Dave looked around at his friends and smiled and nodded. And a second later, guess who joined in? That's right, all the girls. And 5 seconds later, the hooting and the whooping began. It was loud in that cafeteria. It was incredibly loud. The clapping and cheering were so loud that the sound went right through the cafeteria doors and walls and thundered down the hall all the way to the school office and right through the closed door of Mrs. Abigail Hyatt, principal. The phone on Mrs. Champlain's desk buzzed. An intercom called. "Yes," she answered. The secretary listened and nodded and said, "Right away." She got up and walked out of the office and down the hall and into the cafeteria where it had gotten quiet again. Mrs. Marlowe was standing near the doorway, and Mrs. Chaplin whispered something to her. Mrs. Marlowe nodded and quickly walked halfway across the room. She bent down close to Dave Packer's ear and said, "To the office." Dave swallowed his third bite of macaroni and cheese and looked up into the science teacher's face. "I have to?" She nodded. "Principal's orders." Dave looked around the table at his friends. No one needed to speak a word. Their faces said it all. And the message? 3 simple words, and Dave believed them. "You are dead." Chapter 19. Apologies. There were 227 green tile squares on the hallway floor between the cafeteria and the school office. Dave counted each one to keep from thinking about what was going to happen next, but he thought about it anyway. Mrs. Chaplin pointed at the principal's door. "Go right in." Dave knocked. He knew he didn't have to, but it bought him another 2 seconds of delay. Mrs. Hyatt yelled, "Come in," and Dave thought, at least she's not using her bullhorn. He opened the door, and she was standing with her back to him, looking out the window into the school courtyard. Dave blurted out, "I'm sorry." And he said that because he knew he shouldn't have yelled at the principal, even if he had been right, which he still believed he was. He also apologized because he hoped it might help save his life. Mrs. Hyatt turned around, and Dave was shocked to see the look on her face, because she wasn't mad. She almost looked like she had been crying, and her nose was pink. She shook her head. "That's why I sent for you, so I could say that to you. I'm the one who got angry, and I yelled first, and I set a terrible example, so I hope you'll forgive me." Dave couldn't remember the last time a grown-up had apologized to him, and to have the principal saying she was sorry, well, he could barely manage a nod at that. She nodded back and then paused and said, "So what are we going to do about this situation?" Not sure," Dave said. She frowned. "Please, you can talk freely in here. None of your friends can hear us." Dave shook his head. "Honor system." Mrs. Hyatt's eyebrows went up. "Oh, of course, very admirable. Well, maybe you can answer some questions for me just to get started." Dave said, "Sure. First of all, how did all this get going? Who started it?" Dave smiled. "Mahatma Gandhi." "Pardon me?" Mrs. Hyatt said. Dave said, "He stopped talking." The principal said, "And someone wanted to try that here at school, right?" And Dave nodded and pointed at himself. "All my fault," he said. "I see," she said. "How did you learn about Gandhi?" He said, "Social studies report." "And why did he stop talking?" Dave shrugged. "To think more." "But you're not keeping silent, not totally. Why?" Dave thought a moment, and then he said, "Respect for school," which he knew was going to make him sound like a goody-goody. But it was true. He and his friends weren't trying to shut down the school, not at all. Mrs. Hyatt nodded slowly and said, "Oh." She seemed to be out of questions, and during that 3 or 4 seconds of silence, an idea jumped into Dave's mind, but he pushed it out. It was too outrageous. But the idea bounced back into his head, and this time Dave just blurted it out. "Want to join?" Mrs. Hyatt bunched her eyebrows together. "What do you mean?" Join Stop Talking. She looked at Dave as if he had just told her to put on a grass skirt and dance the hula on the roof of the school bus. Don't be silly. I'm the principal. Do you have any idea how many people I have to speak to every single day? Dave pointed at a notepad on her desk. May I? She nodded, and he wrote, you can say only 3 words in a row, and only if a teacher or a grown-up talks to you first, except you can talk to a kid first, because you're sort of a teacher, and no talking at all outside of school, honor system, and the whole thing's almost over anyway, just until tomorrow. Then Dave smiled up at her and said, it's interesting. Mrs. Hyatt shook her head. I could never. Dave put his hand up like a traffic officer. There, stop 3. Mrs. Hyatt smiled, and it wasn't a principal smile. Dave could tell. She was smiling like a real person. She smiled because she realized Dave had offered her something important. Just 5 minutes earlier, he had acted like a monster, but she wasn't, not really. Still, she had behaved terribly. Everyone in the cafeteria knew that, kids and grown-ups, both. And news like that spreads quickly. So somehow she needed to remind everyone that she wasn't a monster fast. And Dave had just offered her a way to become human again, because it's a well-known fact that monsters do not have a sense of humor. She tore Dave's sheet off the notepad, bent over the desk, and did some writing of her own. She stepped quickly into the office and handed Mrs. Chaplin the paper. The secretary read it over quickly and said, and I should. The principal held up 1 figure and said, type. Then she held up 2 figures and said, duplicate. And then she held up 3 figures and said, distribute. And Mrs. Chaplin said, got it. Then turning to Dave, the principal said, ready, set, go. Dave's head was spinning, but he managed to say, where? She was already out of the office door, and over her shoulder, Mrs. Hyatt said, to the cafeteria. Chapter 20, The Winners. At this point, it might be fun to tell how Dave followed the principal back to the cafeteria and how Mrs. Hyatt apologized to the whole 5th grade by trading 3-word phrases back and forth with Dave, who also apologized, and describing the looks on the faces of all those 5th graders in the classroom, not to mention Mrs. Marlowe and the rest of the staff. That might be fun too. Or it might be interesting to tell how Mrs. Hyatt called an all-school assembly 5 minutes later by chiming the school intercom and then saying, everyone, auditorium, hurry, and how all the teachers in every grade were given 5 minutes at the assembly to explain the new no-talking rules to their students, and how loud and confusing it was as they did that, and then how completely quiet it got when the principal announced, silence starts now. And it might be enlightening to explain how Mrs. Hyatt had changed the contest so that kids in kindergarten through 4th were competing grade against grade to see who could say the fewest illegal words during the next 23 hours, and why she thought her way was a better idea than boys against girls. And it might be thought-provoking to explain how Dave felt about all this, how he felt that he was sort of like Gandhi, and how Mrs. Hyatt was sort of like the British Empire, and how he felt like there had been a great victory, with liberty and justice for all, which included Mrs. Hyatt herself. And Mr. Burton, there's a lot that could be told about him, because he went completely stratospheric. He spent the next 24 hours of the contest scribbling down notes, taking photos, and using a little handheld recorder to capture as many 3-word sentences as possible. He collected so much great material that he began thinking that he would not only write that paper for his human development course, he could practically write a whole book about the way the kids and teachers at Laketon Elementary School had changed the way they expressed themselves, changed their view of language itself, what it is, how it works, and how communication can take so many different forms. And speaking of human development, it might be fun to explore why the very youngest kids could not even imagine how to go without something as amazing and powerful as talking, not even for 10 minutes, which is why the whole kindergarten was immediately excused from the activity. And how about Thursday morning, when the boys reported 0 honor system word goofs and the girls reported only 1, telling how Dave and Lindsay reacted to that news would be revealing. And then it would certainly be fun to peck at the challenges Mrs. Hyatt faced as she kept to a strict diet of 3 words at a time. On Wednesday afternoon and again on Wednesday morning, she talked with parents, with the superintendent, with the principals of other schools, with the electrician who arrived to repair the milk cooler, and of course with her teachers and with hundreds of kids, all of whom thought it was great to have a principal who just might be a little bit crazy. In fact, the story could jump a whole week ahead or even months ahead to see the way the fifth graders completed the school year as kinder, more careful talkers and thinkers. Because there's absolutely more to tell. There's always more. But as tempting as it is, it's not the time to tell about all that, because this is the time to jump right to fifth grade lunch on Thursday, right to the point when the original contest was coming to an end, right to that moment of truth when the boys and the girls were getting ready to compare their final scores. Because with all the goodwill and the happy vibes that swirled out of Mrs. Hyatt's change of heart, plus the excitement of having the whole school go quiet, you might think that somehow the fifth grade boys against girls contest didn't matter anymore. But it did. Remember when Dave stood up and shouted at the principal on Wednesday? Did you think no one was counting? Not true. Everyone was counting. Dave had said 30 words. Grand words, brave words, true words. However, all but 3 of them were illegal. At 12:14, 1 minute before the end of the contest, the cafeteria was silent. Every fifth grader was watching the second hand on the big clock, and so were all the fifth grade teachers, and Mrs. Hyatt, and the custodian, and the school secretary, and the school nurse too. No one wanted to miss the moment in the history of the unshushables. Dave and Lindsay sat across from each other at the same lunch table, ready for the big tally. Dave dug around in his back pocket and found a crumpled sheet listing all the points against the girls, and Lindsay pulled out her little red notebook and a pencil out of her backpack, and she bent over it, adding and scribbling away. Glancing down, Dave saw something poking out of the top pouch of Lindsay's backpack, a huge permanent marker, a red one. And Dave had no trouble at all imagining a big L on his forehead, because he already knew the final scores for both teams, and he was sure Lindsay did too. With just 15 seconds to go in the silent cafeteria, Lindsay stood up, looked down at the red notebook, took a deep breath, and she talked. I have to say this, my whole opinion changed about boys. You really did the honor system great, and being quiet, also great. Everyone together, so thanks. And then the second hand pointed straight up, and it was 12:15, and the contest was over. A yell went up that nearly peeled the tiles off the floor. Kids jumped out of their seats and ran and stood bouncing face to face with groups of friends, and everyone jabbered faster and louder than human beings ever should, laughing and nodding and telling everybody everything they were thinking and feeling. And the louder it got, the louder everyone had to talk to be heard above the rising tumult, and the sound spiraled up toward that point where the dogs run and stick their heads under a sofa. And amidst the burst of joy and noise and confusion, Lindsay shouted to Dave, "What's the official count?" Dave nodded, cupped his hands around his mouth, and bellowed, 47 against the girls. Lindsay looked at her notebook. She didn't try to talk. It was too loud for that. She turned the notebook around, and at the bottom of the page, a number was circled. 74 against the boys, a huge defeat. Lindsay gave him an odd smile, and Dave was ready for the teasing to begin. But she shouted, "You didn't count." He was confused. Count? Count what? Lindsay yelled as loud as she could, "You didn't count what I said at the end." Dave shook his head. "What?" The sound around them was deafening. Lindsay flipped a page and then turned the red notebook around so Dave could see it. And there was her whole little speech, written out word for word. The last word was thanks, and above it she had written a number, 27. Dave nodded slowly as he stared at the speech and saw what Lindsay had done. He did the math in his head, 7 plus 7, and carried the 1. She had made the contest an exact tie, 74 points for each team. And their private war to see who got to label the other a loser? Also a tie. Her 27 words matched the illegal ones he had yelled at Mrs. Hyatt. Was it all too perfect? Of course it was. Had Lindsay messed with the score against the boys to make it add up that way? Without a doubt. Would there be a big investigation? Not likely. Dave kept looking at the notebook. Lindsay's speech was filled with crossouts and changes. She had chosen those last words so carefully, making every word count. He wanted to say, I owe you big time. He also wanted to say, I guess I'm pretty much of an idiot, aren't I? But most of all, he wanted to say what she'd already said, thanks. But Dave and Lindsay just sat there, grinning at each other in the noisy cafeteria, and neither of them said a word. Not one word. So we have finished reading No Talking. Wow. The last chapter is called The Winners. Do you think there are any winners? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? Are there any losers? Is it better to win or to work together? Can you predict at all whether these kids will be changed in the future because of this experiment that they've done? Have they realized that talking is really about more than just making noise, and it's about thinking? And didn't that principal, whoa, she really blew up, but she then pulled it together for sure. Andrew Clement, the author of No Talking, has written lots and lots of books that we have at the library. If you've liked this, come on in and get another one to read. And thank you so much for listening. We've been reading Andrew Clements' No Talking with permission of the publisher, Simon & Schuster. I'll see you soon.